Tombstone, Arizona, the richest city that water killed. The soldiers at the camp tell him there is nothing out in those hills but Apache country and an early grave. Keep wandering alone like that, they say, and the only stone you will ever find is your own tombstone. So when this stubborn half-broke prospector finally cracks open a vein of silver in the dry country above the San Pedro River, he remembers the warning, and out of pure spite, he names the claim Tombstone. Within a few years, that grim little joke is one of the richest cities in the American West. And here is the part almost nobody tells you. The thing that finally destroyed it was not the famous gunfight everyone remembers. It was water. If you want the real version, the history under the legend, take a second to subscribe and hit the like button. Now let me show you how a city drowns in the middle of a desert. Let me give you the whole shape of it before we step inside, because if you only watch the next few minutes, this is the part that matters. Tombstone was, for one short and blazing stretch, the richest silver city in the Wild West. It rose out of bare desert on one man's lucky strike, with no railroad, no river, almost nothing around it but rock and heat. And it was not outlaws, and it was not that 30 seconds of gunfire near the OK Corral that killed it. It was groundwater. Plain underground water that rose up out of the rock and flooded the mines until the arithmetic simply stopped working. Hold on to that, because everything else hangs off it. The man with the lucky strike was named Ed Schieffelin. He drifts into southern Arizona territory in the year 1877, a lean, bearded man in clothes worn down to the thread, the kind of prospector other men quietly laughed at. He makes his base near a brand new army post called Camp Huachuca, and from there he walks out alone, again and again, into hills the army considers too dangerous to enter, because Chiricahua Apache bands still move freely across that country. The scouts think he is a fool with a death wish. They tell him to his face that the only rock he will ever carry out of those hills is the one they will lay over his body. He finds silver instead. Somewhere in those hills above the San Pedro Valley in 1877, he locates ore so rich it changes his whole life in a single afternoon. And with that warning still ringing in his ears, he files his first claims under names chosen to settle the score. One he calls Tombstone, the next he calls Graveyard. Then comes the Lucky Cuss, and the Tough Nut, and later the Contention, names that tell you everything about the gallows humor of a man who has just proved every soldier in the territory wrong. A strike like that cannot stay a secret. Word runs north to Tucson and west to the coast, and the rush is on. Prospectors, gamblers, carpenters, and merchants all start pointing themselves at one dry mesa in the middle of nowhere. A town site is staked out in 1879 on the high flat ground above the mines, and it takes the name of the claim that started it all, Tombstone. Within months, the tents turn into rough lumber, and the lumber starts turning into brick. A city is being born on top of a silver vein. And the cruel thing, the thing none of those first arrivals could have known, is that the same silver that built it was sitting directly on top of something that would one day drown the whole place in the dark. Now picture what they actually built out there, at its peak. Somewhere around 1881 and 1882, Tombstone may have held as many as 15,000 people, though the records on that number are slippery, and historians still argue the true figure. Even at the low end, it was one of the largest settlements between San Antonio and the Pacific coast, and remember where it sat. The nearest railroad ended at Benson, roughly 25 miles to the north. Everything else had to come the last stretch by wagon and mule, hauled up over rough road in the heat, and yet they hauled in luxury anyway, because the silver paid for it. This was the strange magic of a silver boom. A miner in Tombstone could earn around $4 a day, at a time when a cowboy out on the trail was making about $1 a day for far harder, dirtier work. That kind of money pulls goods across a desert, so a town with no river and no railroad gets a theater called Schieffelin Hall, and a notorious all-night house called the Bird Cage. It gets the Crystal Palace and the Oriental saloons with polished bars and chandeliers. It gets restaurants serving oysters that had been packed in ice and freighted in from the coast, fine clothing shipped from back east, even ice itself and telephone lines, out here, in the 1880s, in the middle of Apache country. People who had crossed half a continent of dust would step off the stage and find a city eating oysters under gaslight. Underneath all of it ran the real machine. The silver did not magically become a city on its own. There were the mines themselves. Shafts driven deeper and deeper into the hills. There were the mills, the stamp mills crushing ore and pulling the silver out. many of them placed down along the San Pedro where there was water to run them. There were the freighters moving timber and ore and supplies, the merchants taking a cut of every wage, the saloon keepers and gamblers taking the rest. Tombstone was not a story about gunfighters. It was a money machine, and almost everyone in town was a moving part inside it. And yes, this is where the famous names belong. The Earp brothers came to Tombstone like thousands of others, chasing the money around the edges of the boom, dealing faro, holding lawman jobs, eyeing business interests. The Clantons and the McClorys ran cattle and moved in the rough country outside town, tangled up in the trade in stolen stock that always grows along a busy border. These were real hard men in a real crowded place. But understand their true size in this story. They are characters inside the boomtown. They are not the engine of it. And they are not the reason it died. All of it, the opera house, the oysters, the lawmen and the cowboys, sat on top of a single problem that nobody in town was talking about yet. A problem rising slowly in the dark, far below the richest minds. But before we go down into that dark, we have to deal with the 30 seconds the whole world remembers. Because if you know one thing about Tombstone, it is probably this. It is the afternoon of October 26, 1881. Tensions between the Earps and a loose group of cowboys, including the Clantons and the McClorys, have been building for weeks, fed by old grudges, threats, and the constant friction of a crowded town. And at the center of the flashpoint is something almost boringly practical. A town ordinance. Tombstone, like a lot of boomtowns, had a law against carrying firearms inside the town limits. You were supposed to check your guns when you came in. On that day, the Marshal Virgil Earp moves to enforce that rule against armed men who refuse to give up their weapons. Virgil, his brothers Wyatt and Morgan, and Doc Holliday walk down to confront them in a narrow vacant lot near the back of the OK Corral, off Fremont Street. The actual fight lasts about 30 seconds. Roughly 30 shots are fired in a space barely wider than a room. When the smoke clears, 3 men are dead, Billy Clanton and the 2 McClory brothers. It was not a grand duel at high noon. It was a short, ugly, confused burst of close-range violence in a cramped lot. The kind of thing that grows out of too many armed men, too much money, and too little law in one small place. The bloodshed did not end there either. In the months that followed, Morgan Earp was murdered. Virgil was crippled by an ambush, and Wyatt rode out on a campaign of revenge that scattered his enemies and his own reputation across the territory. It is a real event. It is a tragedy and a scandal that gripped the whole country. And it is, in the end, a symptom. It is what you get when a silver boom packs thousands of armed strangers onto one mesa faster than any law can keep up. The movies turned that 30 seconds into the soul of the entire town. And ever since, people have believed that Tombstone lived and died by the gun. But the gunfight did not empty Tombstone. The street stayed busy for years afterward. The thing that actually killed the richest city in the West was not waiting in a dusty lot with a pistol. It was rising in the dark, foot by foot, deep inside the mines. And it had no face at all. Here is the trap that Tombstone was built into from the very first claim. The richest silver in those hills lay deep. And in that part of the desert, if you dig deep enough, you do not hit bedrock and stop. You hit the water table. You hit the level where the ground itself is saturated, where water sits inside the rock waiting for you to open a hole and let it move. In the early 1880s, as the big mines like the Grand Central and the Contention chase the silver downward, their shafts pass through somewhere around 500 and 600 feet, and the water finds them. It does not come as a dramatic flood out of nowhere. It seeps, it rises. It fills the lowest workings and then keeps climbing, slow and patient and absolutely relentless. Because you are no longer fighting a rival miner or an outlaw. You are fighting the desert's own groundwater, and it never sleeps and it never quits. So the mine owners do the only thing they can. They go to war with the water. They bring in enormous pumps, great Cornish-style pumping engines of the kind first perfected in the deep tin and copper mines of Cornwall in England. Machinery built for exactly this fight. These were monsters of iron and steam, designed to lift water hundreds of feet and pour it back out onto the surface. The Grand Central and the Contention companies install pumping plants and pour money into them, burning fuel day and night just to hold the water down far enough to keep working the ore below. And for a while, it works. The pumps win. The water is held back. The silver keeps coming up, and from the streets of town you would never know there was a slow, grinding battle being fought in the dark beneath your feet. But think about what that battle actually costs. Every foot the mines go deeper, the more water there is to lift. Every day, The pumps burn fuel that has to be freighted in across that same long desert road. The deeper the silver, the more expensive it becomes to keep the water off it. It is an arms race, and the desert has unlimited reserves. Then came the fire. In 1886, fire broke out in the hoisting and pumping works of the Grand Central Mine, the very heart of the operation that was holding the water down. The plant, the machinery, the great pumps, all of it was destroyed. And here is the moment the whole story turns. In any ordinary business, you rebuild. But the men running these mines now had to do something colder. They had to do the math. To replace those pumps and start the fight again would cost an enormous sum. And the silver they would be fighting to reach was worth less every year, because the price of silver had been sliding through the 1880s and would keep sliding into the great collapse of the next decade. So they ran the numbers. And the numbers said stop. The cost of pumping the water out had finally climbed past the value of the silver that pumping would let them reach. The moment that line was crossed, the fight was over. There was no villain to shoot, no enemy to outdraw. There was only arithmetic, and arithmetic had won. The pumps fell silent, and the water, which had been held off for years by all that iron and fuel and effort, simply did what water does. It rose, it filled the shafts the men had spent fortunes to dig. It climbed back up through the workings, and it drowned the richest mines in the West in the dark, where no one ever saw it happen. So let us put it back together, the way the records actually tell it. A man is warned he will find nothing in that country but his own tombstone, and out of spite he names a silver claim after the joke. A city of thousands explodes around it, with theaters and oysters and telephones in the middle of the desert. A famous gunfight breaks out in a narrow lot and burns itself into the legend forever. And all the while, the thing that would actually end it was rising quietly underground, waiting for the moment the cost of fighting it grew too high. It was not outlaws. It was not the Earps or the Clantons. It was not that 30 seconds at the OK Corral. It was water and arithmetic. When the pumps stopped, the reason to stay stopped with them. The miners packed up and chased the next strike. The merchants followed the miners. The grand buildings emptied out one by one, and the desert that had always been waiting at the edge of town began, slowly, to take it back. And Ed Schieffelin, the man who started it all, the man who named the place after a grave as a joke, eventually grew rich, sold out, and could never quite stop prospecting. He died in 1897, out in the field with his tools, still looking for the next vein. By his own wish, they brought him back and buried him in his prospector's clothes on a hill outside the town he had made, under a tall stone monument shaped like the marker on a miner's claim. So in the end, the joke came true after all. The man who found silver where everyone promised him only a tombstone got both, the richest city in the West and a real stone on a desert hill with his name on it. Remember that the next time someone tells you the West was won and lost by the gun. The town the gunfighters could not kill was killed by something with no gun at all.